The auctioneer's hammer came down with a crack that made Marcus flinch, but it wasn't the sound that made his stomach drop. It was the number that had just left his sister Elena's lips. $370,000. Every penny of their inheritance, including the money their grandmother had specifically set aside for their college loans, their future homes, their children who didn't even exist yet. All of it for a rotting barn that looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. The man in the expensive suit sitting 2 rows ahead turned around slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. And Marcus knew they had just made either the best decision of their lives or signed their own financial death warrant. Harrison Crenshaw, CEO of Crenshaw Development, the man who never lost an auction, had just been outbid by 2 28-year-old twins who ran a failing bookstore. Elena's hand found Marcus's and squeezed hard enough to hurt, but he squeezed back just as firmly because he could feel it too. That electric sensation running through the musty air of the community center, the feeling that they had just stepped off a cliff without knowing if there was water or rocks below. The morning had started so differently, with them planning to bid maybe $50,000 maximum, just enough to honor their grandmother's dying wish that they buy back the old family property. But then Crenshaw had kept raising, and something in Elena's eyes had gone hard and determined, the same look she used to get when kids at school said twins were creepy. The walk to the payment desk felt like walking through water, every step heavy and slow while dozens of eyes followed them, some puzzled, some pitying, and Crenshaw's assistant was already on his phone, probably calling lawyers or whoever rich people called when they didn't get their way. The clerk who took their information looked at them like they were insane, actually asked twice if they were sure about the amount. And Marcus wanted to laugh, because no, they weren't sure about anything except that their grandmother had grabbed Elena's hand 3 weeks ago in the hospital and whispered something that had made his sister turn white as paper. 20 minutes later they stood in front of their $370,000 mistake, and Marcus felt his knees go weak because it was worse than the photos had shown. So much worse that even the October wind seemed to avoid it, flowing around the structure like it might catch something contagious. The barn sat in a field of dead grass like a shipwreck in a sea of brown, its red paint peeled away to reveal gray wood that looked soft with rot, and half the roof had caved in during last winter's storms, leaving the interior exposed to months of rain and snow and whatever animals had decided to make it their home. Elena walked forward like she was in a trance, her feet crunching through the frost-brittle grass, and Marcus followed because that's what he'd always done, followed his sister into trouble and occasionally into something amazing, though looking at the tetanus factory in front of them. He was betting heavily on trouble this time. The main doors hung at angles that defied physics, held on by single hinges that screamed when Elena pushed them open, and the sound echoed through the hollow space beyond like a warning, like the barn itself was trying to tell them to leave while they still could. The smell hit them immediately, decades of hay gone to dust, mouse droppings, mold, and something else underneath it all, something chemical and sharp that made Marcus think of his high school chemistry lab, of experiments gone wrong and beakers full of things that shouldn't be mixed. Elena pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a vast space filled with shadows and shapes that could have been old farm equipment or could have been anything really, because the darkness seemed to eat the light before it could travel more than a few feet. They picked their way through the debris, around rusted plows and mysterious tangles of metal that might have once been important, but now just looked like expensive ways to get tetanus. And Elena kept moving toward the back of the barn with that same determined look, like she knew exactly where she was going even though neither of them had been inside this place since they were 5 years old. Marcus remembered that day vaguely, a family reunion or something, lots of adults drinking lemonade and kids running around. But mostly he remembered their grandfather pulling them aside and telling them to stay out of the barn, that it wasn't safe for children, and the way he'd said it had made it sound like it wasn't really safe for anyone. The floorboards creaked under their weight, some of them so soft that Marcus's foot went partially through one, and he yanked it out with a curse that echoed in the empty space. But Elena didn't even turn around, just kept moving toward the northeast corner where the shadows seemed thickest, where even her phone's light seemed reluctant to go. She stopped suddenly, so abruptly that Marcus almost ran into her. And when he looked over her shoulder, he saw what had caught her attention. A section of floor that was different from the rest, newer boards forming a rough square about 6 feet by 6 feet, and in the center of that square was a metal ring bolted into the wood. Elena handed him the phone and knelt down, wrapping both hands around the ring and pulling. But nothing happened except for a groaning sound from somewhere deep below, like the earth itself was protesting. And Marcus was about to suggest they leave and come back with proper tools when his sister did something that made his blood run cold. She knocked on the newer boards, 3 short taps, 2 long ones, 3 short ones again, and from somewhere below, impossibly, came an answering knock, the exact same pattern. And then silence, so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, like a drum calling him to war he hadn't signed up for, but was apparently going to fight anyway. The answering knock from below froze them both for exactly 3 seconds before Elena grabbed the metal ring again and pulled with every ounce of strength she had. And this time Marcus dropped the phone and grabbed on too, both of them heaving until it would started to splinter and crack around the edges, revealing that this wasn't just a trapdoor, but something much more elaborate, with metal hinges that looked military grade and a locking mechanism that had been broken from the inside. The metal twisted outward like something had forced its way up rather than down. The door finally gave way with a sound like a gunshot, sending them both tumbling backward into a pile of moldy hay, and when Marcus scrambled for the phone and pointed it at the opening, he saw wooden stairs descending into perfect darkness, each step worn smooth in the center, like hundreds of feet had used them over many years. Elena was already moving toward the stairs when Marcus caught her arm and pulled her back, because whatever had made that answering knock hadn't come up to greet them, which meant it was either automated somehow or something was waiting down there, and neither option seemed particularly safe given that they were alone in an abandoned barn that nobody knew they were exploring. He picked up a rusted bolt from the floor and dropped it down the opening, counting the seconds until it hit bottom. But instead of a clang or thud, there was a splash, which made even less sense because they were on a hill and the water table in this part of Pennsylvania was at least 40 feet down, according to the Geological Survey he'd looked up when they were researching the property. They descended together, Marcus going first with the phone, while Elena kept one hand on his shoulder, and the temperature dropped with each step until their breath came out in visible puffs, which shouldn't have been possible because even underground it was October, not January. And the deeper they went, the more wrong everything felt, like they were descending into a space that didn't quite belong to the world above. The stairs ended at a metal door that looked like it belonged on a submarine, complete with a wheel handle and rubber seals around the edges. And when Marcus turned the wheel, it moved smoothly, recently oiled, which meant someone had been maintaining this place, someone who might still be down here, someone who had knocked back. The door opened into a concrete room about 20 feet square, lined with metal shelving units that reached the ceiling, and every shelf was packed with glass jars filled with liquid that glowed faintly green in the phone's light, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one labeled with a date and a series of numbers that meant nothing to Marcus, but made Elena gasp and grab one of the jars, holding it up to the light and reading the label over and over like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The liquid inside moved strangely, not quite like water, more viscous, almost alive, and when she tilted the jar, Marcus could swear he saw shapes forming and dissolving in the green glow, faces maybe, or just his imagination running wild in this impossible place. The sound of dripping water made them both turn, and in the corner of the room was another door, this one standing slightly open, and through the gap came a rhythmic drip, drip, drip that echoed in the silence, but also something else, a humming sound, mechanical and steady, like a generator or pump system still running after all these years. Elena set the jar carefully back on the shelf and moved toward the door, and Marcus wanted to stop her, wanted to grab her and run back up those stairs and pretend they'd never found this place. But he followed instead, because that's what twins did. They followed each other into the dark and hoped they'd both come out the other side. The second room was bigger, much bigger, stretching back into darkness beyond the phone's reach, and the floor was covered in water about an inch deep that reflected their light in strange patterns. But it was what stood in the center of the room that made Marcus forget how to breathe for a moment, because there was a metal box the size of a coffin, sealed with more locks than seemed reasonable. And on top of the box was an envelope with their names written on it in their grandmother's handwriting, which was impossible because she'd been dead for 3 weeks, and this envelope looked fresh, the paper white and crisp like it had been placed there minutes ago. Elena reached for the envelope with shaking hands, and when she opened it, a key fell out along with a single sheet of paper covered in their grandmother's careful script, and Marcus read over her sister's shoulder as the words explained everything and nothing at the same time, telling them that what they'd found wasn't meant for them, but for the people who would come after, that the jars contained something that could change everything, that their grandfather had spent 30 years of his life creating this place in secret, working with a team of scientists who'd been dismissed as crazy by the establishment. The letter ended with coordinates, longitude and latitude that meant nothing to Marcus, and a warning that once they opened the box, there would be no going back, that forces would align against them, that Crenshaw Development wanted this land not for the barn, but for what was beneath it, what their grandfather had hidden here when the project was shut down in 1987. The key fit into the first lock on the metal box with a click that sounded like a judge's gavel, final and irreversible. And as Elena turned it, the humming sound grew louder, and the water on the floor began to ripple outward from the box in perfect circles, like something inside was waking up, like their presence had triggered something that had been waiting patiently for 36 years for the right people to come, the right DNA. Because that's when Marcus noticed the small panel on the side of the box, a scanner of some kind, and he knew with horrible certainty that it would only open for them, for the twins whose grandfather had built this impossible place. The second lock turned easier than the first, and the green glow from the jars in the other room seemed to intensify, casting their shadows on the walls in duplicate and triplicate until the room seemed full of versions of themselves, all watching as Elena turned the third lock and the fourth, and with each turn, the air grew thicker, harder to breathe, charged with electricity that made their hair stand on end and their skin tingle with something that might have been fear or might have been anticipation. The final lock released with a hiss of pressurized air, and the top of the box began to rise on hydraulic hinges, so smooth and quiet that they had to be impossibly advanced for something built in the 80s. And inside, cushioned in foam that hadn't aged a day, was something that made Marcus understand why their grandmother had made them promise to buy this barn, why she'd looked so scared and so proud at the same time, why Crenshaw would do anything to get his hands on this place. Inside the box lay hundreds of photographs, each one sealed in plastic, and beneath them were rolls of film in metal containers and stacks of documents stamped with classification marks that had been blacked out with marker, so thick that the paper had absorbed it completely. But it was the photographs that made Elena's hands shake as she picked them up one by one, because they showed their grandfather standing next to machines that shouldn't have existed in the 1980s, devices that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, all connected to the green glowing jars by tubes and wires in configurations that hurt to look at for too long. Marcus picked up one of the documents and started reading, but the technical language was so dense that he could only understand fragments, something about biological preservation, about consciousness transfer, about a project called Lazarus that had been funded by a part of the government that officially didn't exist, and their grandfather hadn't just been involved, he had been the lead researcher. The photographs got stranger the deeper they dug into the box, showing test subjects hooked up to the machines, their bodies submerged in tanks, filled with the same green liquid that was in the jars upstairs. And in one particularly disturbing image, a man was sitting up in one of the tanks with his eyes open, clearly conscious, breathing the liquid like it was air. And the date stamp showed this was taken 3 days after the official records showed he had died in a car accident. Elena found a journal wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of the box, and when she opened it, their grandfather's familiar handwriting spilled across the pages in increasingly frantic entries about breakthrough after breakthrough, about how they had found a way to preserve not just the body but the entire consciousness, about how death itself had become optional for those who knew the secret. The sound of car doors slamming above them made them both freeze, and Marcus checked his phone to see 6 missed calls from an unknown number and a text that just said they had 10 minutes to get out before things got complicated. But they were already complicated because someone knew they were down here. Someone had been watching, waiting for them to find this place. Elena shoved as many photographs and documents as she could into her jacket, while Marcus grabbed the journal and 3 of the film canisters. And they could hear footsteps on the barn floor above, multiple sets, moving with purpose toward the corner where the trapdoor was. And whoever it was didn't care about being quiet, which meant they weren't worried about scaring the twins away. They were confident they had them trapped. They ran back through the room with the glowing jars, and that's when Marcus noticed something he'd missed before. Another door hidden behind one of the shelving units, painted the same gray as the concrete wall, and when he pushed on it, it opened into a tunnel that stretched away into darkness. Clearly an escape route their grandfather had built, because he knew someday someone would come looking. Elena grabbed 5 of the jars from the nearest shelf, wrapping them in her jacket to keep them from breaking. And they entered the tunnel just as they heard the trapdoor above being wrenched open with power tools. The sound of the wood splintering echoing down the stairs like thunder, and voices shouting orders in the kind of tone that suggested military or private security. Definitely not local police. The tunnel went on for what felt like miles, but was probably only a few hundred yards, sloping upward gradually until they could feel fresh air coming from somewhere ahead. And when they finally emerged, they were in the woods behind the barn, coming out through what looked like an old storm cellar that had been carefully concealed with branches and decades of fallen leaves. They could see flashlight beams sweeping through the barn's broken walls, and at least 3 black SUVs parked in the field, and Marcus recognized one of the men standing by the vehicles as someone he'd seen at the auction, someone who had been sitting near Crenshaw, taking notes every time anyone bid. And now it made sense why the businessman had been so angry when they won, because this wasn't about developing the land. It was about what was hidden beneath it. Elena pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of everything. The vehicles, the men, the license plates, uploading them immediately to 3 different cloud services, because she knew as well as Marcus did that physical evidence had a way of disappearing when powerful people wanted it gone. And they needed insurance, needed leverage, needed something to keep them alive long enough to figure out what their grandfather had really been doing down in that bunker. They made it to their car without being seen, but as Marcus started the engine, another vehicle pulled up behind them, blocking them in, and Marcus's heart sank until he saw who got out, Mrs. Chun from the pharmacy, the woman who had filled their grandmother's prescriptions for 20 years, and she was holding a shotgun in a way that suggested she knew exactly how to use it. She walked up to Elena's window and tapped on it with one gnarled finger. And when Elena rolled it down, Mrs. Chun leaned in and said something in Mandarin that neither twin understood, then switched to English, and told them their grandfather had saved her husband's life in 1986, not with medicine, but with something else, something that the men in those black SUVs would kill to understand. And she had been waiting 30 years to repay that debt. She handed Elena a business card that looked perfectly normal except for the phone number, which had too many digits to be real, and told them to call it when they got somewhere safe, to say the word Lazarus, and someone would come to help them, someone who had been part of the original project, someone who had been waiting for the right people to find what was hidden in the barn. The men were coming back up from the bunker now, and from their body language, they were angry probably because they'd found the room empty, the important documents and photographs gone, and it would only be minutes before they realized the twins had been there first, before they started looking for them. And Mrs. Chun stepped back and raised her shotgun, not pointing it at anyone yet, but making it clear she would if necessary. She told Marcus to drive to the old fire road that ran behind the cemetery, to take it all the way to Route 47, and not to stop for anyone or anything, not even if they saw police lights, because not everyone wearing a uniform could be trusted anymore. And, as if to prove her point, a sheriff's car pulled up and Deputy Morrison got out. But instead of helping, he walked straight to the men in black and started talking to them like they were old friends. Marcus threw the car in reverse and floored it, spinning around Mrs. Chen's vehicle and onto the grass, tearing across the field toward the tree line, while Elena twisted in her seat to watch their 6. And she saw Mrs. Chen's shotgun come up, saw her fire into the air, a warning shot that made everyone duck and bought them precious seconds to reach the fire road. And as they bounced over the ruts and roots, Elena opened one of the jars she'd taken. Just a crack, just enough to smell what was inside, and the scent was impossibly complex, like ozone and copper and something floral. And for just a moment, she could swear she heard voices coming from a liquid, whispers in languages that had been dead for thousands of years, and she understood why their grandfather had hidden this, why men would kill for it, why their grandmother had made them promise to find it, because this wasn't just about preserving life. This was about something much bigger, something that would change the very nature of what it meant to be human. The fire road ended at Route 47, just as Mrs. Chen had promised, but Marcus didn't slow down, taking the turns so hard that the tires screamed against the asphalt, and Elena had to grab the door handle to keep from sliding across the seat, the jars in her jacket clinking together in a way that made them both wince, because breaking one might mean losing evidence they couldn't afford to lose. They drove for 20 minutes before Marcus pulled into an abandoned gas station, his hands shaking so badly he could barely put the car in park. And that's when they noticed the black sedan that had been following them since Route 47, maintaining perfect distance, never getting too close, but never falling back either. And they both knew, without saying it, that they were being herded somewhere, that whoever was in that sedan was waiting for them to stop somewhere isolated, somewhere without witnesses. Elena dialed the number on Mrs. Chen's card, adding the extra digits that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. And after 3 rings, a voice answered that sounded like it was coming through water, distorted and strange, asking for a verification code. And when Elena said Lazarus, the line went silent for so long she thought they'd been disconnected. But then the voice came back clearer, urgent, telling them to get to the Riverside Motel on Highway 19, room 237, that someone would meet them there in 2 hours, and whatever they did, don't let anyone else see what they'd taken from the barn. The black sedan was still there when they pulled back onto the road, and now there was another one ahead of them, boxing them in, but not making a move yet, just following, watching, and Marcus thought about ramming one of them, about trying to escape, but Elena put her hand on his arm and shook her head, because they both knew these weren't people you ran from. These were people you outsmarted or you disappeared. The motel was exactly as sketchy as it sounded, one of those places that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions. And the desk clerk barely looked up when Elena paid cash for the room, just slid a key across the counter and went back to watching television. And Marcus wondered if the man was naturally incurious or if he'd been paid to be that way. Room 237 was at the end of the second floor. And as they climbed the exterior stairs, Marcus counted at least 4 places where someone could be watching them. But the parking lot stayed empty, except for their car, and a few trucks that looked like they hadn't moved in years. And the black sedans were nowhere to be seen, which somehow made him more nervous than if they'd followed them in. The room smelled like cigarettes and disinfectant, and Elena immediately went to the window to check the parking lot while Marcus pushed the dresser in front of the door, knowing it wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in, but hoping it would at least give them warning. And then they sat on one of the beds and finally looked at what they'd grabbed from a bunker, really looked at it in proper light. And the photographs were even more disturbing than they'd seemed in the darkness. One showed their grandfather injecting the green liquid into a man's arm, and in a series of photos taken over what the timestamps indicated was the next 6 hours, they could see the man's body changing, not dramatically but subtly, his skin taking on a faint luminescence, his eyes becoming brighter. And in the final photo, he was holding his hand over an open flame, the fire licking at his palm, but causing no damage. No burn, nothing but a slight shimmer in the air around his skin. The journal entries were harder to understand, full of formulas and references to other documents they didn't have. But one entry from March 1987 was crystal clear. Their grandfather writing about how the project had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, but also beyond their worst nightmares. How they had created something that could make humans effectively immortal, but at a cost that he was only beginning to understand, that the subjects who had undergone the full treatment were changing in ways they hadn't anticipated, developing abilities that couldn't be explained by conventional science. And worse, they were losing something essentially human in the process, becoming something else, something that looked human but wasn't quite. He wrote about how the military applications were obvious, how they could create soldiers who couldn't die, who could survive any environment, who could do things that would make every war movie look like a documentary about weakness. But he also wrote about his growing fear that they were playing with forces they didn't understand, that the green liquid wasn't just preserving life, but was changing it at a fundamental level that went beyond DNA, beyond biology, into something that touched on what people might call the soul. A knock at the door made them both jump, and Marcus grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, a lamp that probably wouldn't do much good against whoever was outside. But the voice that came through the door was female, older, asking them to please let her in, saying she was the one they were waiting for, that she had worked with their grandfather, that her name was Dr. Sarah Winters, and she could explain everything if they would just open the door. Elena looked through the peephole and saw a woman in her 70s, gray hair pulled back in a bun, wearing a cardigan that looked hand-knitted, about as threatening as a librarian. But they'd learned today that appearances meant nothing. So Marcus kept the lamp raised as Elena slowly moved the dresser and opened the door just wide enough for the woman to squeeze through. Dr. Winters sat down on the other bed like her bones hurt, which they probably did at her age, and she looked at the photographs spread across the bedspread with an expression that was equal parts nostalgia and regret, picking up one that showed her much younger self standing next to their grandfather. Both of them in lab coats, both of them smiling like they'd just won the Nobel Prize, not knowing that within 6 months, everyone in that photo, except for her and their grandfather, would be dead, killed in what the newspapers called a chemical plant explosion, but what was really a deliberate act of destruction by people who wanted the project ended and all evidence destroyed. She told them that their grandfather had suspected what was coming, had hidden samples and documents in multiple locations, including the barn, and had spent the last years of his life trying to find a way to reverse what they'd done, to help the subjects who had been transformed. But he died before he could finish his work, taking the locations of the other sites to his grave. Or so everyone thought until their grandmother had contacted her 3 months ago, telling her that she was dying, and that her grandchildren would need help when they found what their grandfather had hidden. The sound of engines in the parking lot made them all freeze, and Dr. Winters moved faster than someone her age should have been able to, pulling a gun from her cardigan pocket and checking the magazine with practiced ease. And she told them that Crenshaw's grandfather had been one of the generals overseeing the project, that he had stolen samples before the facility was destroyed, that Crenshaw Development was just a front for continuing the research, and they had been buying up all the land where they suspected their grandfather had hidden evidence, but they hadn't known about the barn until the twins had found it first. She said they had maybe 5 minutes before the men outside decided to come in, and they needed to make a choice. They could give her everything they'd taken and disappear, let her handle this the way she'd been handling it for 30 years, or they could come with her and finish what their grandfather had started. But if they chose the second option, there was no going back. They would be entering a war that had been fought in shadows for decades, and people who entered that kind of war rarely came out unchanged. Elena looked at Marcus, and he looked back at her, and they had one of those twin conversations that didn't need words, just tiny movements of eyes and hand that said everything that needed to be said. And then Elena turned to Dr. Winters and asked where they were going, and the old woman smiled for the first time, a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, and said they were going to visit the subjects, the ones who had survived the transformation, the ones who had been living in hiding for 30 years, waiting for someone to either cure them or kill them. Because living forever wasn't a blessing when you could feel yourself becoming less human with each passing year, when you could sense your memories of being normal fading like old photographs left in the sun, and the twins' grandfather had been the only one who had ever cared enough to try to help them. And now his grandchildren would have to decide if they wanted to finish his work or let Crenshaw turn them into weapons. Dr. Winters led them out through the bathroom window while the men in the parking lot were still positioning themselves around the front door, and they dropped down onto a dumpster and then to the ground, running through the narrow alley between the motel and an abandoned restaurant, where a van that looked like it had seen better days was waiting with its engine running, and the driver was Mrs. Chun, who gave them a grim nod as they piled in and she pulled away just as they heard the motel room door being kicked in behind them. The van smelled like Chinese food and gun oil, a combination that shouldn't have been comforting but somehow was. And in the back were boxes of files, medical equipment that looked military grade, and 3 more jars of the green liquid that Mrs. Chen must have taken from the barn before the men arrived. And she drove like someone who had been running from dangerous people for a long time, taking seemingly random turns that Marcus slowly realized were anything but random, doubling back and switching directions until anyone following them would be hopelessly lost. They drove for 3 hours, leaving Pennsylvania and entering West Virginia, the roads getting smaller and more twisted as they went deeper into the mountains, and Dr. Winters used the time to tell them more about the project, about how it had started as research into extending the life of soldiers injured in Vietnam, how they had discovered the base compound by accident when analyzing water from a cave system where local legends said people had lived for hundreds of years, and how their grandfather had been the one to figure out how to synthesize and enhance it. She pulled out a tablet and showed them videos that shouldn't have existed, classified recordings of the test subjects demonstrating abilities that broke every law of physics Marcus had learned in college. A woman walking through fire without burning, a man holding his breath underwater for 47 minutes, another subject healing from a knife wound in seconds, the flesh knitting itself back together like watching a film in reverse. But in every video, the subject's eyes looked wrong, too bright, too aware, like they were seeing things that weren't there. The van finally stopped at what looked like an abandoned mining camp, the kind of place that had been left to rot when the coal ran out. But as they got closer, Marcus noticed things that didn't fit. Solar panels hidden among the rusted metal roofs, cameras disguised as broken equipment, and the fence that looked falling down was actually reinforced with steel cables painted to look like rust. Mrs. Chun entered code on what appeared to be a defunct electrical box, and a section of fence swung open silently, revealing a road that led deeper into the mountain. And as they drove through, Marcus saw movement in the trees, shapes that might have been people or might have been something else, watching them pass with eyes that reflected the headlights like a cat's. And Elena grabbed his hand because she saw them too. The subjects Dr. Winters had been talking about, the ones who had been hiding here for 30 years. The road ended at a concrete building built into the mountainside, and standing in front of it was a man who looked about 50, but who Dr. Winters said had been one of the first test subjects in 1985, which would make him at least 70. And when he stepped into the light, Marcus could see that his skin had a faint green tinge, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And his eyes were definitely wrong, the irises seeming to shift color as he moved his head from brown to green to something that might have been purple. He introduced himself as Nathan, no last name, just Nathan, and his voice had an odd quality to it, like there were harmonics underneath the main tone that shouldn't have been there. And he thanked them for coming, for bringing the materials from the barn, because they had been trying to reverse the transformation for decades, but were missing key components that their grandfather had hidden, components that might be in the documents the twins had rescued. Inside the building was a fully equipped laboratory that looked more advanced than anything Marcus had seen at university, and there were 12 other subjects there, all showing varying degrees of transformation, some barely changed except for their eyes, others whose skin had taken on the green luminescence so strongly that they glowed faintly in the dark, and one woman whose transformation had gone so far that she could barely speak anymore, communicating instead through written notes, because her vocal cords had changed into something that could only produce sounds outside the range of human hearing. They all gathered around as Elena spread out the photographs and documents on a metal table, and several of them made noises of recognition when they saw their younger selves in the images. And Nathan picked up one particular document with shaking hands, a formula their grandfather had been working on, something he'd labeled as Reversal Protocol 7. And Nathan said this was it. This was what they'd been looking for, but they would need the rest of the notes to complete it. That's when Elena remembered something their grandmother had said in the hospital, not just about buying the barn, but about her journal, about how she'd kept records of everything their grandfather had told her. And Elena had that journal back at their apartment, had grabbed it when they were packing for the funeral, thinking it might have sentimental value, not knowing it contained the other half of the puzzle. She told Dr. Winters and Nathan about the journal, and Nathan's face changed, becoming more human somehow, filled with a hope that made him look younger despite his transformed features. And he said they needed to get that journal, that it might contain the locations of the other sites where their grandfather had hidden materials, that with all the pieces together, they might finally be able to undo what had been done to them. But Dr. Winters was looking at her phone with an expression that made everyone go quiet, and she turned the screen toward them, showing a news report about a fire at a barn in Pennsylvania, about how the historic structure had burned to the ground despite the efforts of local firefighters. And in the background of the footage, they could see Crenshaw talking to reporters, expressing his disappointment that such an important piece of local history had been lost just days after he tried to purchase it for preservation. The barn was gone, the bunker beneath it probably destroyed or sealed, and Crenshaw was sending a message that he would destroy everything connected to the project rather than let anyone else have it. And Marcus realized their apartment was probably already being watched, that getting the journal would mean walking into a trap. But they didn't have a choice, because without it, the 12 people in this room would remain trapped in bodies that were becoming less human every day. Nathan stood up and said he would go with them, that his abilities might be useful. And when Marcus asked what he meant, Nathan held out his hand and it began to shimmer, becoming translucent and then transparent, like he was fading out of existence. And then he was gone completely, invisible, though Marcus could still hear him breathing, could smell the faint ozone scent that all the transformed subjects seemed to carry. And then Nathan reappeared, looking tired but satisfied. And he said he could do that for about 30 minutes at a time, long enough to get in and out of the apartment without being seen. 3 other subjects volunteered to come as well, each with their own abilities that might help. And Dr. Winters said she knew people who could provide backup, old colleagues from the project who had been fighting Crenshaw's family for decades. And, as they prepared to leave, the woman who couldn't speak anymore handed Elena a note that said thank you for caring, that their grandfather had been the only one who had seen them as people rather than weapons or experiments. And now his grandchildren were carrying on that legacy. Mrs. Chun would stay at the compound to analyze the documents they'd already recovered. And as they loaded into different vehicles for the journey back to Pennsylvania, Marcus noticed that more subjects were emerging from the forest, dozens of them, maybe more, all transformed to varying degrees, all looking at the twins with expressions of hope and gratitude. And he understood that this wasn't just about 12 people in a building. This was about an entire community of transformed humans who had been living in exile for 30 years, waiting for someone to either accept them or cure them. And their grandfather had been working on both, trying to find a way to reverse the transformation for those who wanted it, while also trying to create a place where those who chose to remain transformed could live without fear of being weaponized or experimented on. And now that responsibility had passed to the twins. The drive back to Pennsylvania took all night, and Nathan sat in the back of the van practicing his invisibility while 2 other subjects, a woman named Carol who could see heat signatures through walls, and a man called Dennis who could hear conversations from a mile away, planned the approach to the apartment building. And Marcus kept thinking about how surreal it was that yesterday morning he'd been worried about paying rent, and now he was in a van with people who had superhuman abilities, planning what amounted to a heist. Elena had called their landlord from a burner phone Dr. Winters had given him, pretending to be a cousin checking on the apartment while they were out of town, and the landlord had mentioned that some men in suits had been asking about them, that there had been a gas leak reported in their building, and officials were checking every unit, which was obviously a lie, but meant Crenshaw's people were already there, already waiting, and Nathan said that was good, actually, because it meant they knew where the enemy was rather than wondering when they'd show up. They parked 3 blocks away as dawn was breaking, and Dennis closed his eyes and listened, his head tilting slightly as he sorted through all the sounds of the waking city. And after a minute, he said there were 4 men in the twins' apartment, 2 in the lobby, 2 more in a van outside, and they were talking about how the twins would have to come back eventually, how people always came back for their personal things, how Crenshaw wanted them taken alive if possible, but dead was acceptable. If they resisted, Carol looked at the building through binoculars that had been modified with some kind of thermal imaging technology and confirmed Dennis's count, adding that 2 of the men in the apartment were standing by the windows, 2 were sitting in the living room, and from their heat signatures, they'd been there all night, which meant they were probably tired, slower to react. And Nathan said that was their advantage. That, and the fact that these men didn't know what they were dealing with. The plan was simple in the way that dangerous things often are. Nathan would go in invisible, get to the apartment, retrieve the journal from Elena's closet, where she said it was hidden in a shoebox with old photographs, and get out without anyone knowing he'd been there. But plans never survive first contact with reality. And this one fell apart the moment Nathan disappeared and walked toward the building, because Dennis suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm and said there was someone else in the apartment, someone who hadn't been there a moment ago, someone whose heartbeat was strange, too slow, too regular, like they were medicated or not entirely human. Carol looked again and saw a 5th heat signature, but it was different from the others, cooler, more diffused. And she said it looked like one of them, one of the transformed subjects, and Dr. Winters's face went pale as she said that was impossible, that all the subjects were accounted for, that no one had joined Crenshaw's side. But then she stopped mid-sentence and whispered a name none of them had heard before, Thomas, and her hands started shaking. Thomas had been the first successful test subject, Dr. Winters explained quickly, the one who had undergone the most extensive transformation, the one who had seemed to embrace the changes rather than fight them. And he had disappeared the night before the facility was destroyed, taking samples and research data with him. And they had assumed he was dead, killed in the explosion or by the government cleanup crews. But if he was here, if he was working with Crenshaw, then everything was much worse than they'd thought, because Thomas had abilities none of the other subjects had developed, abilities that had scared even the military officials overseeing the project. Before anyone could stop him, Marcus was out of the van and running toward the building, because Nathan was walking into a trap and didn't know it. And Elena was right behind him, and Dennis and Carol were shouting for them to stop, but they couldn't, because Nathan was in danger, and he was only there because of them. They burst through the lobby doors just as Nathan became visible again, stumbling out of the stairwell with blood running from his nose. And behind him came a man who looked perfectly normal except for his eyes, which were completely green, no whites, no pupils, just solid green that seemed to glow from within. And when he saw the twins, he smiled and said their grandfather had talked about them, about how special they were, about how their DNA might hold the key to perfecting the transformation rather than reversing it. And that's why Crenshaw wanted them alive, to use them as test subjects, to create a new generation of transformed humans who wouldn't suffer the negative effects. Thomas moved faster than should have been possible, crossing the lobby in 2 steps and grabbing Elena's arm. And where he touched her, the skin immediately turned green, the transformation spreading up her arm like infection. And she screamed as Marcus grabbed a fire extinguisher and swung it at Thomas's head, but the man caught it with his free hand and crushed it like it was made of paper. Carol and Dennis arrived then, and Dennis let out a sound that Marcus felt more than heard, a subsonic pulse that made Thomas let go of Elena and cover his ears, giving Carol time to grab the twins and pull them outside while Nathan, despite his injury, turned invisible again and tried to slow Thomas down. But they could hear the impacts as Thomas swung at where he sensed Nathan was, could hear Nathan gasping in pain, and then Dr. Winters was there with her gun, firing rounds that Thomas barely seemed to notice, the bullets hitting him but not penetrating, his transformed skin too tough, too changed to be damaged by conventional weapons. Elena's arm was still partially green, the transformation slowing but not stopping, and she was crying from the pain, saying it felt like her bones were dissolving and reforming. And Marcus remembered the journal, remembered that it was still in the apartment, and without thinking, he ran back into the building, dodging around Thomas, who was focused on fighting Nathan, and took the stairs 3 at a time. The men in the apartment were all facing the door when Marcus burst through the window from a fire escape, having climbed up the outside of the building while they were distracted by the commotion below. And he grabbed the shoebox from Elena's closet while they were still turning around. But one of them managed to grab his ankle as he went back out the window, and they both fell onto the fire escape, rolling and fighting, as the metal structure groaned under their weight. The journal fell from the box, pages scattering in the morning wind, and Marcus watched in horror as some of them floated away, but he managed to grab the main volume, the one with the formulas and locations, just as the man pulled out a knife, and then Dennis was there, having climbed up after him. And he grabbed the man and did something with his hands that made the man go limp. Some kind of pressure point technique he'd learned during his transformation. They made it back to the street to find Thomas gone and Nathan visible but badly hurt, his face swollen and one arm hanging useless at his side, and Elena's arm had stopped changing but remained partially green, the skin having a scaled texture that caught the light strangely, and Dr. Winters was already on the phone calling for backup, telling someone that Thomas was alive, that he was working with Crenshaw, that they needed to evacuate the compound immediately because if Thomas knew about the twins, he knew about everything. As they loaded into the van, Carol said more vehicles were coming, a lot of them, and they drove away just as black SUVs converged on the building from 3 directions. And Dennis said he could hear helicopters in the distance, military grade from the sound of their rotors, and Dr. Winters said they weren't going back to the compound, that it was compromised, that they were going to the last safe house, the one place even Thomas didn't know about. The safe house turned out to be an old farm in Ohio that looked abandoned from the outside, but had a fully equipped medical facility in the basement. And as Dr. Winters worked on Elena's arm, applying some kind of compound that slowly reversed the green scaling, she explained that this had been their grandfather's final laboratory, the place where he'd done his last work before he died. And hidden in the walls were samples of every version of the formula they'd created, including the failed ones, the ones that had killed test subjects or worse, driven them insane. And she said that with the journal and these samples, they might be able to create not just a reversal, but an inoculation, something that would prevent anyone from ever being transformed against their will again. Elena's arm slowly returned to normal over the course of 6 hours, and during that time, Marcus read through their grandmother's journal, finding notes in the margins in their grandfather's handwriting, coordinates for 12 other sites, descriptions of different variants of the formula, and most importantly, a message to his grandchildren that he'd obviously made their grandmother include, telling them that the choice of what to do with this knowledge was theirs, that they could destroy it all, or use it to help those who had been transformed, or even continue the research if they believed it could benefit humanity. But whatever they chose, they should remember that every scientific discovery could be used for good or evil, and the only thing that determined which was the character of the people who controlled it.